I've always been a little bit envious of people with large, close-knit families. My family doesn't seem to have much of a history in this country. Honestly, I'm not sure we have much of a history anywhere else either. My grandfather arrived from Ireland at a very young age, and we never kept close ties with the old country. I have no knowledge of any relatives that may remain. There are little isolated pockets of us spread throughout New York, and perhaps down south. We all got a little bit of a surprise when a Hillis was drafted by the Denver Broncos. He even wound up signing with the Giants for a few years toward the end of his career. Peyton Hillis, I don't know if you remember him, Karen. But in lieu of a large, close-knit family, I found the church, as many people have throughout history. Across a series of local churches, starting in my early teens, I found friends, mentors, meaning, opportunities to make a difference in the world. But eventually God brought me into this Methodist thing and directed me by strange pathways to become something of a steward of our history. Not someone else's history, but the stories of what have come to be my people, our extended family of faith. And I want to tell you this morning a story, an example of this, that I may have shared with you in passing. But there's a young man from New York, there was a young man from New York several hundred years ago, whose name you may have heard before. His name was Philip Embury. And he's credited with founding the first Methodist church here in North America, down in the financial district on John Street. You're familiar with it. Some of you even visited it. But he originally hailed from the Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany. And alongside several hundred families in the face of war and famine, he initially migrated to Ireland to find a better life. But from there, Philip and his kin eventually made their way onto boats and traveled to the American colonies, where he worked as a school teacher and sometimes a carpenter. But truly, he had always wanted to return to farming. So after a spell in the infancy of New York City, he received a grant of 8,000 acres upstate to develop for the manufacture of linen. So Philip did something interesting. He gathered up a whole crew of Irish immigrants. He didn't reserve this to himself alone, but seeing it as a generational opportunity for all sorts of folks who needed a new home, he gathered together all of these immigrants, and they began to make their way north to conquer the wilds. And they traveled up the Hudson River until they found this new place that they had been given, and they set to work. Now, unfortunately, Philip died young, as many did in those days. He was involved in a farming accident, and after his death, they buried him in the Woodland Cemetery of Cambridge, New York, my hometown. Now, in my youth, I must have walked by Philip's grave 100 times. My sister liked to hike the cemetery. It's called Woodlands, but it's really a giant hill. And, back in those days, we were kind of free-range parented, in the 90s. So my friends and I would often find our way down to the cemetery in the dark of night to try to scare one another. It was very creepy. But at the time, his tomb held no meaning for me. I hadn't made my way into the Methodist church yet. But now it seems almost providential, as if I was always supposed to trace his route back down the river to the city where it all started. And I tell you this story because the words of 1 Peter we've heard this morning, they no longer represent an abstract concept to me. It's not some highfalutin idea. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. To me, when I read the story of Philip Embury, he might as well be my ancestor. Now, Peter was writing, the author of this epistle, was writing to scattered and emerging congregations in Asia Minor, the region of the world we call Turkey today. And having heard the stories of Jesus of Nazareth and coming to his saving faith, they were struggling to build themselves up as a community. They were trying to figure out, who are we? What does this story mean for us? And they found that they were searching for a new identity, one no longer grounded in traditional kinship networks or familial legacy. Something transformative had occurred, and they were now a new people. Now, many of these first converts to the Christian faith were poor, marginalized. A lot of them were women, and not a few of them were enslaved. That's precisely who was drawn to this Christian story of salvation, liberation, restoration. They were a people who didn't need a faith that just sounded good. They didn't need just a spiritual salvation. They needed a tangible, material, and relational uplift. So Peter directed them to ground themselves in the study of the Scriptures. Like infants, they will find it as nourishing as milk until they are formed into the very stones that will build the church. A place of proclamation, such that other seekers, other people in need might hear the good news and be transformed themselves. As one commentary declares, by the proclamation of God's mighty acts, the church, God's people, is formed. In the church, God's mighty acts are then proclaimed. This is what God does. Calls the church into being to proclaim Christ and so be built up into a house of spiritual stones, all there to proclaim the mighty acts of God. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church together. All who follow Jesus all around the world. Yes, we're the church together. Now, I don't think these words, these concepts, these deep relationships would have been abstract to Philip Embury either. As I told you, he was an immigrant twice over, first to Ireland and then on to the United States. And for him and for those other immigrants who followed him, the church became a place where their new communal identity was formed, where they could be part of a people, even having been scattered into a foreign land. In the church, they found a new identity, communal formation, the proclamation of the good news, their common beliefs. This is what the church does, what it has always done. It's also what this table does. Like those early congregations in Asia Minor, scattered, searching, finding their identity no longer in bloodlines or birthplaces, but in something new, we gather here as people who might otherwise have nothing in common. Different last names, different histories, different kinship networks, different nations or states of origin. By different pathways, we've been brought here this morning to one table so that we might be God's one people. The bread we break is the same bread the church has broken for 2,000 years, whether it was hidden in the catacombs below Rome or eventually in great cathedrals, whether it was on the frontier settlements of the colonial days or even now in these river towns. Philip Embry likely broke this bread too, somewhere along the Hudson, with his congregation of immigrants trying to make sense of a new world. They were strangers becoming a people. And that is exactly what happens here at this sacramental table. In the United Methodist Church, we worship at an open table. That means that you do not need to be a member of this church or any church in order to participate. All we ask is that you would come with a joyful spirit, expecting to be surprised by the work God will do here. We ask that you come hungry for mercy, hungry for belonging, hungry for meaning, hungry to be brought out of the darkness and into God's marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. May it ever be so.